Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Rachel Terry. I'm the author of 2 young adult fantasy books. Information will be in the description box down below if you're interested in learning more. Today, I will be sharing my review and thoughts on Broadway Butterfly by Sara DiVello. This is a jazz age thriller that details the true, unsolved murder of Dot King. When I picked this book up, I actually thought it was fiction, and then I learned that it was in fact true crime, but presented in this way, in a fictional narrative sort of way, but it's real. And afterward, as I was Googling, I couldn't find a great deal of information on this case, which is interesting. This is a very complex book and real-life event, so I will do my best to describe what this book is about and also tell you at the end what I think really happened. This book takes place in 1923 in New York, and it begins where Ella Bradford finds Dot King murdered in her bed in her apartment. Ella is Dot's maid and apparently her only friend and confidant. Ella is a black woman living in the 1920s, so she faces racism and hardship, and she is unfairly singled out in the course of this investigation for various different reasons. But she knew Dot better than pretty much everybody else. Dot was born poor. She was the daughter of Irish immigrants, and Dot King was not her real name. She was born Anna Keenan, and when she left home and bobbed her and dyed her hair, she changed her name, and she became a star on Broadway and went into modeling, and she made something of herself. You can disagree with how she went about doing that, as people in this book do, but she came from nothing. She made something from herself, and she was notoriously generous, like insanely generous. She not only knew what it felt like to come from nothing, but she remembered that, and she helped other people who were less fortunate than herself. So she was a really interesting individual, and there are no shortage of people who may have had the opportunity or the reason to want her dead. One of those is her gigolo boyfriend, who is known to be a woman beater. He has beaten Dot on multiple occasions, according to Ella. He has bite marks on his hand that fit with the struggle that took place in Dot's bedroom, so he obviously has the temperament and the means to kill her because he was with her that night. However, there's also the mysterious Mr. Marshall, who is her sugar daddy, whose real identity isn't known. And he was the last person to see Dot King alive. The elevator operator says he took Mr. Marshall up but did not bring him back down, which, if he's telling the truth, means that Mr. Marshall could only have left the building by taking the fire escape stairs, which are not the safest, and he really wouldn't do that unless he had something to hide. So those are our two main suspects in this case. This book is told from the point of view of 4 different people. Ella Bradford, the maid, is one of them. Inspector Coughlin is another. He is the head of the detective division at the New York Police Department. Then we have Julia Hartman, who is a newspaper woman, and she's pretty incredible for her time. Again, keep in mind that all these people are real and this stuff really did happen. This isn't just a fictional story. Julia Hartman not only had a wonderful marriage by all accounts, but she kept her own name, she had a successful career, she worked in a field, journalism, which was mostly men, and she had a byline, which she got 2 weeks before she started covering the Dot King murder case. Bylines were incredibly rare back then, and only the best of the best could get them, and she was the best of the best covering the court beat. She was relentless in her pursuit of justice. She would not let the Dot King case go, even when it became stalled and just covered up, and it became clear that there was corruption involved, because Dot King knew a lot of people, and one of those people was Mr. Marshall, whose real identity is revealed as none other than John Kearsley Mitchell III, who is married to Frances Stotesbury Mitchell, who is our other point of view character. Frances Stotesbury Mitchell is the daughter of E.T. Stotesbury, and I had never heard of the Stotesbury family prior to reading this book, but apparently back in the day they were very, very powerful and wealthy people. They were very influential in politics and government and society, and E.T. Stotesbury was the Philadelphia partner of the original J.P. Morgan. Shortly before all of this happens, the Stotesburys are set to host President Harding while he tries to begin his bid for re-election, which is not going to be an easy thing, because if you know anything about President Harding, you know he was a very scandal-ridden president, and so the Stotesburys are hoping to use their social influence to help his re-election along, but all of those parties get canceled when Mr. Marshall's real identity is leaked as Mitchell, and we get to see the effect this has on Frances, that it becomes public knowledge that not only is her husband a philanderer, he's also possibly a murderer. Because he was the last person to see Dot King alive, it's very possibly he may have killed her. So this basically ruins the family. Their fortune is intact. They don't suffer financially, but they're basically cut off from society and from events, and their friends just drift away and their invitations to social events dry up. And the family was so wealthy that when the Great Depression hit and the stock market crashed, they really didn't suffer. They lost a lot of money, but they simply had so much money that they could afford to lose that much. So they didn't suffer financially, but I don't think they ever really recovered from this scandal. So those are our point of view characters. That is the premise. It soon becomes clear that there's a lot of powerful people involved, such as Arnold Rothstein, who rigged the 1919 World Series, and he's also a gangster, and he's got his hands in lots of different things in New York. Dot King lived in a building owned by him. She also made frequent trips to Atlantic City, which was big on the drug trade, and she knew Nucky Johnson, who was also a gangster there and very powerful, and they were an item at one point. So other than Mitchell and Albert the Gigolo, there's one other man that needs to be mentioned, and his name is McBrien, and he is friends with Albert, and he gives Albert an alibi saying that Albert was with McBrien and McBrien's girlfriend, Aurelia, the night of the murder, therefore he can't be guilty. So there are some powerful people involved, and it becomes clear that justice is basically being stymied early on. The case isn't going anywhere. The police are focused on Albert because he's an easy suspect, and he may very well be guilty, but there are powerful men at play, and there's corruption involved, and it becomes clear that things are being hidden. It's alleged that Mitchell paid $500,000 to the DA to keep his name out of it, to basically shut the investigation down and make sure it doesn't go any further. He also has ties to the Attorney General and his son, and the Attorney General has scandals with another individual, and people are bumped off, and it's just a mess of corruption. And the fact that this is real is really alarming, but also not surprising. The 1920s were a crazy time, and when you had Tammany Hall in New York, corruption basically ran rampant. And in a way, it's reassuring because people seem to think that the way that politics and government works now, it's so horrible and it's so corrupt, and really it's not any more or less corrupt than it's always been. I think it's just that we know so much more about it now than they did back then, and even then I'm not sure, because I think the newspapers tried to bring light to the corruption and what's going on, and we see those efforts through Julia Hartman, but they just can't really do anything because the powers that be are so entrenched and so powerful, and if you speak out on these things, you basically risk your own life. So things haven't really changed much in 100 years. But all of that to say, this is still an unsolved murder mystery to this day. The police never pegged anybody for it. They couldn't solve it. So let's delve into a bit of spoilers here. Near the end of the book, Aurelia reaches out to Julia Hartman 6 years after the Dot King case has been officially closed, and she says that she's perjured herself. 6 years prior to that, while the case was still active, she claimed that she was with McBrien, her boyfriend, and Albert the Gigolo, who knew Dot, which gave Albert an alibi. Now she's saying she perjured herself and she wants to come clean. And she's going to meet with Julia on Monday and tell her what happened. However, before she can do that, Julia receives a telegram that says Aurelia fell from a balcony, very likely pushed, and she was with McBrien at the time, which leads Julia to question, why would McBrien want to silence Aurelia before she can say how and why she lied? And the conclusion is that he must have had something to do with the Dot King murder. So one of the things at the crime scene is that Dot was chloroformed, and they find a very large bottle of chloroform, so large in fact that it's not sold in pharmacies, and most of the people at the pharmacies have never even seen a bottle that big. They didn't know it was manufactured in that size. So Julia uncovers where this came from. It turns out in 1917, bottles of this size were manufactured and sent to France during the war, and then once the war was over, the surplus were sent back to the United States, and they were recently sold off. However, the pharmacy companies realized that because this chloroform was older, it was far more powerful than normal and therefore should not be used for medical reasons. So they warned people, do not use this for medical purposes when they sold it off. Turns out that chloroform is also used as a solvent for rubber, and John Kirsten Mitchell III just happened to have a rubber reclamation business where old tires were brought in and then basically dissolved down to be made into new things, and chloroform and acetone is the combination used for that. So Mitchell's business bought up those giant bottles of chloroform, which means that Mitchell had the chloroform bottle that was found at the crime scene, which means that Mitchell is involved with the murder of Dot King somehow, which leads back to the question, why would McBrien want to silence Aurelia if he wasn't somehow involved? If Aurelia simply lied about the alibi that she gave Albert that night, big deal. McBrien wasn't there, or was he? Perhaps he and Albert teamed up together to kill Dot, and the motive that they have for Albert was Mitchell apparently wrote some pretty spicy love letters for the time to Dot, Albert wanted to get his hands on those letters so that he could blackmail Mitchell. And Dot allegedly didn't want to go along with that, so the suspicion was that Albert killed Dot to get the letters. Which doesn't add up if Mitchell was in fact involved in the murder somehow, and he had to be because his chloroform bottle was there. Why would Mitchell help Albert kill Dot if Albert wanted to blackmail Mitchell? It just doesn't add up. So here's what I think happened. We are told that Dot told Mitchell that he either had to settle up with her or get lost. Mitchell had promised Dot that he was going to divorce his wife and he and Dot were going to go to Paris and be married, which I don't think Mitchell ever had any intention to do because that's just something that men tell women when they're having an affair. And I think Dot realized that he had no intention of doing that either, so she gave Mitchell an ultimatum. Either do what you promised to do or get lost. Well, I don't think Mitchell ever intended to divorce his wife and marry Dot because it would have caused an immense scandal. And we see the scandal that occurs when it comes out that Mitchell was in fact involved with the dead girl and possibly murdered her as well. We see the scandal, we see its effects on the Stotesbury-Mitchell families. So I don't think that Mitchell would have wanted a scandal in any capacity, if at all possible. And so when Dot gave him an ultimatum, I think he realized he can't divorce his wife. He never planned to divorce his wife. So he has to leave Dot. However, Dot has those scandalous love letters that he wrote to her, which the newspapers have a heyday with. So that ends up coming out anyway. But obviously Mitchell wouldn't want that to come out. So he probably thinks that if he comes clean with Dot and admits that he can't marry her and that he's leaving, she might be a little upset about that. And since she has those scandalous letters, she might decide to make them public, or she could use them as blackmail material. I think Mitchell viewed those letters as a threat and he wanted to get them back, and so he hired Albert and McBrien to get the letters for him. Now, whether they intended to kill Dot or not, I don't know. The fact that the chloroform was more powerful than normal could mean it was an accident, but either way, that's what I think happened. I think they were all three in it together. That's the conclusion that the book basically draws, and that's the reason why I think they would have worked together. I think the story that Albert spun about him and Dot wanting to conspire to blackmail Mitchell and then Ella Bradford saying that Dot didn't want to go along with it, I think Albert spun that blackmail story as a way of creating an alibi in a way, because in reality he, I think, was hired by Mitchell along with McBrien to get the letters that could have caused problems for Mitchell later on in the future, and it just went horrifically wrong. But either way, we don't know to this day because the case remains unsolved. All in all, I am very glad that I read this book. I learned so much, which I love learning about these sort of things. It was entertaining, it was fast-paced. I just love the sort of thing where you know there's corruption afoot and you have a character determined to expose it and drag it into the light. That's just one of those things that I love, like reading about evil empires and resistances and things like that. It's just one of those niche things that I really enjoy. I'm disappointed that justice was never served, at least in this world. Dot King's murder was never solved. Her murderer was never brought to justice. His identity was never really revealed. I think I am pretty confident in my hypothesis that that is what probably happened, because it definitely seems, based on the evidence, that all three of those people were involved, and I can't see why they would have worked together unless they had a common goal like that. And McBrien and Albert both are the kind of people who would do anything for money, so there's that. But the 1920s is one of my favorite historical time periods, so I really enjoyed reading about that. I learned a lot about that. I appreciated the sheer amount of research and time and effort that went into crafting this book. Obviously, these are real people, but they are drawn in this book in a way that makes them seem like real people. And I was amazed at that, even though you don't get a lot of detail about some of their lives. Like Inspector Coughlin, for example, we don't know a great deal about him, but we know enough to know that this is a complicated individual. There is more than we see on the surface. And I appreciated the notes at the end of the book that told you where everybody ends up at the end. There's a lot that happens in the course of this investigation that I didn't even talk about in this video. I don't want to spoil anything. I just think that if you're interested in learning about a real-life case and just how twisty and complex it became, definitely read this book. I am so happy that the author chose to tell this story, to bring light to a little-known unsolved murder case, and I definitely agree with the way the book concludes, in which she says that perhaps this is the way that Dot King will live on. We can't solve the murder. Her killer is dead by now, so he'll never be brought to justice in an earthly court, but this keeps her story and her memory alive, and it's just really well done, and I was surprised because this was not on my TBR. I came across it at my local library, thought it sounded interesting, thought it was fiction, wasn't fiction, but truth is sometimes stranger than fiction, and this book definitely proves it, especially the notes at the end of the book. It was so good. It's just so full of little interesting weird tidbits that make you realize reality is weird. So there you have it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you. My name is Rachel Terry. I am the author of 2 young adult fantasy novels, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!